Amid the luxury of a silent restaurant, a lonely magnate stares at an untouched plate. But when a young mother, hungry yet dignified, asks for his leftovers, something inside him breaks. The simple act of sharing food rekindles a forgotten flame within his chest, and unknowingly that moment seals the birth of a new family. In the elegant penthouse of the Skyline Tower, with a privileged view of downtown London, Thomas Miller contemplated the city that never slept. At 45, the founder of Miller Tech, Britain's largest software company for the financial market, had conquered everything money could buy. His empire was worth billions, but his heart remained empty since he had lost Amanda and Philip in a tragic helicopter accident 10 years ago. Saturday night at the Savoy Grill was a solitary tradition he religiously maintained. A table for two, always reserved in his name, with the second seat permanently empty, a silent tribute to the wife who would never return. The waiters already knew his routine: a good red wine, a medium rare steak, and the distant gaze of someone present only in body. On that rainy June night, as the London drizzle lashed against the restaurant's windows, Thomas idly stirred his practically untouched plate. He observed the other tables, couples celebrating anniversaries, executives closing deals, tourists impressed by the local gastronomy, all living while he merely existed. It was then that the restaurant door opened, letting in not only the cold wind, but also a thin young woman, approximately 23 years old. Her curly hair was tied in a makeshift bun, her simple, worn clothes violently contrasting with the refined ambience. In her arms, she carried a baby wrapped in a faded blue blanket. The receptionist tried to stop her, but the young woman was already advancing between the tables, ignoring the disapproving glances. To Thomas's surprise, she stopped directly in front of him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, in a low but firm voice. "I saw that you barely touched your food. If you're not going to finish it, could I have the leftovers to feed my son?" There was no submission in her request, only dignity and maternal urgency. Her deep brown eyes met Thomas's gaze without shame or hesitation. The baby in her arms, no more than 6 months old, looked curiously at his surroundings, oblivious to the tension of the moment. "Martha, it's all right," Thomas signaled to the receptionist, who was approaching to remove the intruder. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. Julia Evans, and this is my son, Luke." Without another word, Thomas pushed the plate towards her. The young woman, with a skill only mothers possess, cradled the baby in one arm and, with her free hand, carefully began to pack the food into napkins she pulled from her small, worn backpack. "You can sit," he offered, indicating the empty chair opposite him, the one no one had occupied for a decade. Julia hesitated for a moment, then sat down. Gently, she began to feed the baby small mashed pieces of food, blowing on each one to cool it. Little Luke ate eagerly, his eyes sparkling with each new offering. Thomas watched the scene in absolute silence. There was something in that moment that touched him deeply. The simplicity of maternal love, the purity of survival. Something that money could neither manufacture nor simulate. When the baby finished, Julia carefully wiped his mouth, placed him over her shoulder and gently patted his back. "Thank you," she said finally. It wasn't an exaggerated or submissive thank you. It was an acknowledgement between equals, dignified. She stood up and, with a slight nod, left. Thomas remained motionless for a few seconds. Then, on an impulse he himself didn't understand, he threw some notes onto the table and followed her. Maintaining a discreet distance, he watched her walk several blocks until she reached a supermarket car park in the Soho area. There, Julia opened the door of an old Ford Fiesta and got in. Through the fogged windows, Thomas could see that the back seat had been adapted into a small bed for the baby, with blankets and pillows. The driver's seat, fully reclined, served as her bed. Hidden in the shadows, he watched Julia sing a lullaby to Luke, a sweet melody about stars and dreams. The scene was one of painful beauty, the purest expression of love amidst adversity. When the baby fell asleep, Julia got out of the car to stretch her legs. It was then that she noticed Thomas's presence. Her body tensed immediately. "What do you want?" she asked, fear evident in her defensive posture. "Sorry," Thomas replied, keeping his distance. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right." The distrust in Julia's eyes was understandable. A woman alone with a baby in a deserted car park. "We're surviving," she replied dryly. "How did you get here?" The question escaped before Thomas could contain it. Julia hesitated, then, as if deciding she had nothing to lose, replied, "I came from the countryside, from Brighton. When I found out I was pregnant, my family threw me out of the house. Luke's father disappeared as soon as he knew. I came to London looking for opportunity, but—" She gestured to the car, the end of the sentence too obvious to be spoken. "Can I help? I have the means to—" "I don't want your money," she interrupted firmly. "If you want to help, pray that tomorrow my son is warm, fed and safe. That's all that matters to me." Her answer completely disarmed him. In a world where everything had a price, that young woman offered a lesson in real value. "I understand," he said, stepping back. "Good night, Julia." The next morning, as Julia took Luke to sunbathe in a nearby park, someone left a basket beside her car with nappies, formula milk, new blankets, and non-perishable food. There was no card, no name, just a simple note. "So that Luke is warm, fed, and safe today." In the days that followed, small packages continued to appear, always when Julia wasn't around, always with essential items, never money. One afternoon, a pediatrician appeared, saying he was part of a social program that assisted vulnerable children. He examined Luke for free, left vitamins, and his card for emergencies. Julia began to notice subtle changes in her routine. The supermarket security guard, who had previously treated her with suspicion, now smiled and sometimes brought her a hot coffee on cold mornings. The owner of the nearby bakery always saved fresh bread for her. It was as if an invisible network of protection was forming around her. What she didn't know was that, on the other side of the city, in his penthouse at the Skyline Tower, Thomas spent hours organizing this help, always maintaining his anonymity. For the first time in a decade, he felt something beyond emptiness, a spark of purpose that grew silently with each new day. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you will ever hear in your life. October arrived in London, bringing intense rains. In his office at Miller Tech, Thomas looked out the window as the water lashed Oxford Street. His thoughts were in the Soho car park, where Julia and Luke faced the storm in an old car. Over the past 3 months, Thomas's routine had subtly changed. His mornings began with discreet calls to ensure Julia's breakfast was secured at the local bakery. In the afternoon, between meetings, he checked if Luke's needs were being met. At night, before sleeping, he reviewed the weather forecasts, worried about the cold and rain. Martha, his assistant for 15 years, noticed the small transformations. Thomas arrived earlier, left on time, and occasionally smiled on the phone, something unthinkable months before. "Anything different today, Mr. Miller?" she asked, handing him the quarterly reports. Thomas hesitated. Martha was more than an employee. She was almost family, having witnessed his silent grief for a decade. "Remember when you used to say I needed to find something beyond the company to live for?" Martha nodded, surprised by his unusual openness. "Let's just say I'm trying." That same afternoon, as the rain intensified, Thomas received a call from the pediatrician he had hired to look after Luke. "Mr. Miller, we have a problem. I went to check on the baby as you requested, and the situation in the car park is critical. The car is leaking, the humidity is too high for such a small child." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "Where are they now?" "The mother took the baby to a temporary city council shelter, but they can only stay until tomorrow. She refuses direct financial help, as you predicted." After hanging up, Thomas became absorbed in thought. Martha, who had overheard part of the conversation, approached him. "Perhaps it's time to tell this young woman the truth, whoever she is," she suggested gently. "She would reject it," Thomas replied. "She has such pride. You should have seen her." Martha smiled, recognizing the sparkle in her boss's eyes, something she hadn't seen since before the tragedy. Meanwhile, at the municipal shelter, Julia cradled Luke, now 9 months old. The baby had a cold, coughing occasionally. The shelter coordinator approached her. "I managed to extend your stay for 2 more days, but that's the most I can do," she informed her. "You really don't have any relatives who can help?" Julia shook her head. "They cut ties when I got pregnant." "And the child's father?" "He said he wasn't his and disappeared," she replied, without sadness, just stating a fact. The coordinator hesitated before asking, "And this guardian angel who has been helping you, The baskets, the pediatrician. I don't know who it is, Julia admitted, stroking Luke's hair. At first I was suspicious, but they never asked for anything in return. They just leave what we need and disappear. Have you thought about looking for a job? We could look after the little one during the day. I tried in several shops, restaurants, but when I say I have a baby and no fixed address, the doors close. She sighed. I sold crafts for a while, but it's not enough. That night, Julia received a message on the pay-as-you-go mobile phone she had received in one of the mysterious baskets. It was the pediatrician's number. An NGO has secured a small apartment for a vulnerable family, furnished with a 6-month contract. If you're interested, I can take you to see it tomorrow. Suspicious, Julia replied that she would only look. The next morning, the doctor took her to a simple but decent building in the Islington area. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom, living room, kitchen and bathroom, but clean and cozy. There was a small bed set up for Luke, a stocked fridge and the basics to start a life. What's the real price of this? Julia asked suspiciously. None beyond what has already been paid by the NGO, the doctor assured her, handing her the keys and a simple contract. You'll have 6 months to get back on your feet. Use this time to look for a job with a fixed address. Reluctantly, but thinking of Luke's well-being, Julia accepted. When the doctor left, she sat on the small sofa and cried, not from sadness but from relief. For the first time in over a year, her son would sleep in a real bed. The next day, she found an envelope at the reception with information about a receptionist vacancy at a nearby medical clinic. They accept single mothers and offer flexible hours, the anonymous note read. Julia went for the interview and got the job. As Julia's life took on new contours, Thomas kept his distance but followed everything through discreet reports. In his penthouse, he had set aside a room where he kept photos of Luke taken by the pediatrician, showing his growth month by month. It was a secret archive of a life that wasn't his, but which somehow gave him back his sense of purpose. One night, his brother-in-law Edward, his late wife's brother, showed up unannounced. "We need to talk, Thomas. I'm worried about you." "I'm fine," he replied automatically. "No, you're not. You cancelled the foundation dinner, didn't show up at the board meeting, and according to Martha, you've been leaving early every day. What's going on?" Thomas contemplated the city illuminated through the window. "I met people who needed help." "Since when do you care about charity? After the incident, you practically isolated yourself from the world. Now suddenly you've become a philanthropist?" "It's not charity," Thomas replied calmly. "It's connection." Edward studied him with concern. "It's because of the date, isn't it? Next week marks 10 years since Amanda and Philip left. Look, maybe you should talk to someone, a professional. I'm dealing with it my way." After Edward left, Thomas picked up the latest report on Julia. Luke was growing healthy, already trying to take his first steps, and Julia had been promoted at the clinic after only 1 month. She was determined and intelligent, qualities Thomas admired more and more, even from a distance. As he reflected, he received an urgent message from the pediatrician. "Emergency. Luke has a very high fever and breathing difficulties. Julia is on her way to the municipal hospital, but they're overwhelmed in the emergency room." Without thinking twice, Thomas grabbed his car keys and left. The rain was falling heavily as he drove through London's congested streets. After months of observing from afar, he would finally cross the line he had drawn. It was no longer about helping anonymously. It was about being present when they needed it most. At the hospital, he found Julia in the crowded corridor, cradling Luke, who was burning with fever. The receptionist explained that the wait would be long due to the large number of patients. "My son has been burning with fever for hours. Please," Julia pleaded. "Madam, we're doing our best, but there are many emergencies today," the visibly overwhelmed employee replied. It was then that Julia saw Thomas approaching. The recognition in her eyes was immediate, despite the months that had passed. "You—" "I came to help," he said simply, and addressing the receptionist, he presented his premium health insurance card. "The boy needs immediate attention. I'll take responsibility for all expenses." Without waiting for a response, Thomas took Luke from Julia's arms. The baby, burning with fever, looked at him with glassy eyes before resting his head on his shoulder, as if instinctively recognizing a safe haven. It was such a natural, confident gesture that Thomas felt something break inside him, a barrier erected 10 years ago silently crumbling. "This way, sir," a nurse indicated, noting the premium card and the authority in Thomas's voice. Julia followed them, too stunned to question, her only thought fixed on her son's health. Within minutes, Luke was being examined by a doctor, while nurses prepared intravenous medication to bring down his fever. "Pneumonia," the doctor diagnosed after listening to the baby's lungs. "We'll need to admit him. The fever is very high, and he shows signs of dehydration." Julia covered her face with her hands, a silent gesture of despair. Thomas gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's going to be all right," he said, with a conviction he hadn't felt since losing his own family. "He'll have the best care, I promise." The look of surprise on Julia's face quickly turned to distrust. "What are you doing here? How did you know we were at the hospital?" Thomas didn't have time to answer. Luke convulsed in the nurse's arms, his small body shaking violently. In seconds, doctors rushed to attend to him, taking the baby into the emergency room. Julia followed, casting one last confused glance at Thomas, who remained in the waiting room. The following hours were an eternity. Thomas made several calls, ensuring Luke received the best specialists. When a doctor finally appeared, his expression was serious. "The condition is severe pneumonia, complicated by prior malnutrition, which compromised his immune system," the doctor explained. "We'll need to keep him admitted for a few days. His mother is with him now." Thomas thanked him and, cautiously, headed to the indicated room. He found Julia sitting beside the hospital crib, holding Luke's little hand, now sedated and connected to tubes and monitors. Her face showed the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting alone for too long. "It was you all along, wasn't it?" she asked, without taking her eyes off Luke. "The baskets, the doctor, the apartment, the job." Thomas sat in the chair on the other side of the crib. "Yes." "Why?" The question was simple, but laden with complexity. "Because when I saw you in that restaurant, feeding your son with such dignity, something changed inside me," he confessed. "I had been existing without truly living for 10 years. Julia finally looked at him. "Who are you, really?" "Thomas Miller, founder of Miller Tech." Recognition passed through her eyes. Miller Tech was one of the country's largest tech companies, frequently in the news. "My wife and son died in an accident 10 years ago," he continued, the words coming with difficulty. "Since then, I've been living on autopilot. I built a company, accumulated wealth, but I was just an empty shell inside, until I found you two." "We're not a charity project," Julia replied, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "I never thought of you that way," Thomas assured her. "You awakened me. You made me feel something beyond the emptiness." The silence that followed was interrupted by a nurse entering. Discreetly, Thomas withdrew, promising to return in the morning. On the third day of admission, when Luke was already showing signs of improvement, a nurse recognized Thomas. She discreetly took a photo of the businessman sitting beside the crib, while Julia slept exhausted in an armchair. Hours later, the image went viral. "Tech billionaire has secret child. Thomas Miller caught in hospital with baby and unknown young woman." The avalanche was immediate. Journalists surrounded the hospital. Security had to be reinforced. In the room, Julia woke up startled by the commotion. "What's happening?" she asked, confused. Thomas showed her the news on his phone. Julia's face paled. "My God, what are we going to do?" she whispered, looking at Luke, who was finally sleeping peacefully. "Don't worry," Thomas reassured her. "I'll sort this out." But the situation quickly spiraled out of control. The press speculated intensely. Could Luke be the businessman's unacknowledged son? Who was that young woman? An old extramarital affair? Theories multiplied, each more sensationalist. The next day, Julia tried to discreetly leave the hospital through the back door, with Luke newly discharged. They were met by flashes and invasive questions. A bolder journalist even blocked her path. "How did you convince one of the country's richest men to claim your child?" Startled, Julia protected Luke with her own body. It was then that security guards sent by Thomas appeared, escorting them to an armored car. In the vehicle, Julia cried silently. "I can't go back to the apartment," she said. "They'll chase us. Luke just got out of the hospital." "I have a safe place," Thomas offered. "My beach house in Cornwall, isolated with security. You can stay there until this calms down." Reluctantly, but with no alternatives, Julia accepted. That same afternoon, they were transferred by helicopter to the beachfront house. The contrast couldn't have been greater. Months before, they slept in a car. Now they were in a mansion overlooking the ocean. The house, however, had a melancholic air. Photos of Thomas's late wife and son adorned some walls, smiling faces frozen in time. Julia observed those images with a mixture of compassion and discomfort. Meanwhile, in London, the media narrative became increasingly cruel. A former employee of the clinic where Julia worked sold distorted information. She always talked about finding a rich man. She would show up with expensive gifts but never said where they came from. The internet buzzed with judgments. Julia was portrayed as an opportunist who had seduced a vulnerable widower. Others suggested the baby was the fruit of a clandestine relationship. Few voices questioned, why was a story of humanitarian aid immediately sexualized and corrupted by public cynicism? On the fourth day in Cornwall, Thomas found Julia on the veranda, watching the sea while Luke slept. He handed her a tablet with the latest news. She read in silence, tears streaming down her face. "They're destroying my reputation," she finally said. "How will I get a job after this? How will Luke grow up with these lies about his mother?" Thomas sat beside her. "I can give an interview, explain everything." "And say what? That you took pity on a single mother asking for leftovers in a restaurant? That you helped me out of pity?" The bitterness in her voice was palpable. "Maybe it's better if I go back to Brighton, start over far from all this." "It wasn't out of pity," Thomas replied firmly. "It was because you and Luke showed me what I had forgotten, that there is still goodness and dignity in the world, that it's still worth caring." Thomas's phone rang. It was Martha, his assistant. "Sir, the situation is getting complicated. A tabloid is threatening to publish that the young woman worked as, well, that she has a questionable past." "That's a lie!" Thomas exclaimed, furious. "I know, but they don't care about the truth. And there's more. The board is concerned." The company's shares dropped 3% since yesterday. After hanging up, Thomas found Julia cradling Luke, who had woken up crying. The look she gave him contained a decision. "I can't do this to my son," she declared. "He deserves to grow up in peace, not surrounded by scandals and lies." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, fearing the answer. Julia looked at him in surprise. "Why?" "Because in 3 months of helping you from a distance, I felt more purpose than in 10 years managing a billion-pound company," he confessed. "Because seeing Luke smile in the photos the pediatrician sent was the best part of my day. Because—" A security guard interrupted, announcing that a car had arrived. It was Edward, Thomas's brother-in-law. "We need to talk," he announced, entering the house like a storm. Seeing Julia with Luke, his eyes narrowed. "So the rumors are true." "Edward, it's not what you're thinking," Thomas began. "No? Then explain why my sister's widower is hiding in a beach house with an unknown woman and a baby, while the company we spent years building loses value because of a scandal." "I know your pain, Edward," Thomas replied calmly, "but I can't live like a ghost anymore. Amanda wouldn't have wanted that." "Don't you dare use her name to justify this!" Edward vociferated, pointing at Julia. "Enough!" Julia's voice cut through the air. "I am not this. I am a mother who did everything to protect her son. If my presence is causing so much trouble, we'll resolve it right now." While Edward and Thomas argued heatedly, Julia silently gathered the few things she had brought and left through the back door with Luke in her arms. On the coastal road, she managed to hitch a ride to Chichester bus station. There, she bought a ticket to Brighton with the savings she had put aside. When Thomas finally realized Julia's absence, he found only a simple note. "Thank you for everything you did for us. Luke will never forget your kindness, even if he doesn't remember you." The despair that engulfed Thomas was overwhelming, a pain as physical as it was emotional. Amidst the discussion about public image and corporate responsibilities, he had lost what truly mattered. Again. "Where did she go?" Edward demanded, seeing his brother-in-law's state. "Gone," Thomas replied, his voice choked. "Because of our argument, because you treated her as if she were—" "What? A gold digger? And isn't that what she is?" Thomas stared at his brother-in-law with a firmness he hadn't shown in years. "No. She is the most dignified person I've met in a long time. She refused money, accepted only what her son needed, worked hard to rebuild her life. And above all, Edward, she made me remember that I am still human. The determination in his voice made Edward step back, confused by the transformation he saw in his brother-in-law, a man who had spent a decade merely existing, now brimming with life and purpose. "What are you going to do?" Edward finally asked. "Find her. And this time I won't hide behind anonymous baskets and indirect favors." Thomas grabbed his car keys. "After that, I'm going to do something I should have done years ago. Tell my own story on my own terms." Meanwhile, on the bus cutting through the A27, Julia cradled a sleeping Luke, silent tears streaming down her face. She knew she was doing the right thing, protecting her son from public scrutiny, malicious speculation, judgments. But why, then, did she feel as if she was leaving behind an essential part of herself? In the weeks that followed, Thomas's search for Julia and Luke was relentless. He hired discreet investigators, personally visited Brighton several times, but they seemed to have disappeared. The small coastal town guarded its secrets well, and the residents, protective of a young mother seeking a fresh start, did not reveal her whereabouts. Tired of speculation and lies, Thomas finally accepted the invitation from the most respected news program on British television. On Sunday, prime time, he sat before millions of viewers to tell his truth. 10 years ago, I lost my wife Amanda and my son Philip, he began, without mincing words. Since then, I've been living on autopilot. I built a company, accumulated wealth, but I was just an empty shell inside, until the night a young mother walked into a restaurant, asking for leftovers to feed her son. With disarming honesty, Thomas narrated the entire story. The encounter at the Savoy Grill, the decision to help anonymously, Luke's pneumonia, the distorted media scandal. He spoke about how Julia had refused money, accepting only what ensured dignity and security for her son, about how she worked tirelessly to rebuild her life without knowing who her benefactor was. "It wasn't me who helped her," he concluded, his voice choked. "It was she who saved me. She showed me that there is still room for humanity and true connection in this world." The visibly moved presenter asked the final question, "And now? What do you intend to do?" "Find them," Thomas replied simply. "And tell them personally what I'm telling Britain now. I didn't save Julia and Luke. They brought me back to life." The reaction to the interview was immediate. Social media, once a stage for cruel judgments, now overflowed with messages of support. Find Julia became the top trending topic in Britain. Single mothers shared their stories of struggle and resilience. Organizations supporting vulnerable women offered assistance to locate the young mother. In the small guest house in Brighton where she had taken refuge, Julia watched the interview with a pounding heart. Luke, recovered and playful, crawled around the simple room, oblivious to the national commotion his story had caused. The phone rang. It was her mother, Mrs. Teresa, whom she hadn't spoken to since being expelled from home. "Daughter!" The old woman's choked voice overflowed with regret. "I saw you on television. My grandson. Can I meet him?" The conversation was long and painful, full of apologies and belated explanations. When she hung up, Julia felt strangely light, as if a weight she had carried for years was beginning to dissipate. "What do you think, Luke?" she asked her son, who responded with a bubbly laugh. "Should we give Grandma Teresa a chance?" The next day, the owner of the guest house where she was staying gently knocked on the door. "Julia, there's a reporter downstairs wanting to talk to you. Shall I say you're not here?" Julia's heart raced. "How did they find me?" "Someone from the bus station must have recognized you after that TV interview," the owner explained. "More people are arriving. Journalists, photographers." Julia sat on the bed, stunned. There was nowhere left to hide. The story had taken on national proportions. "Can I use your phone?" she finally asked. With trembling hands, she dialed the number she still remembered, that of the pediatrician Thomas had sent months ago. "Dr. Charles? It's Julia Evans. I need help." In less than an hour, a private helicopter landed in a field near the guest house. An elegant woman in her 50s disembarked. It was Martha, Thomas's assistant. With professional efficiency, she helped Julia and Luke discreetly board, while the press gathered at the guest house's main entrance. "Where are we going?" Julia asked, adjusting Luke's seatbelt. "To a safe place," Martha replied simply. "Mr. Miller is in an emergency meeting with the board, but he asked me to ensure your immediate safety." The helicopter flew over the coast, moving away from Brighton. Below, the southern English coastline unfolded into deserted beaches and green coastal cliffs. After about 40 minutes, they began to descend into an isolated area, a private peninsula, where a modernist house perfectly integrated with the wild landscape. "Welcome to the Isle of Wight," Martha said as they disembarked. "This is one of Mr. Miller's lesser-known properties. No one will look for you here." The house, though luxurious, had a welcoming air that the Cornwall mansion lacked. Instead of ostentatious decoration, there were books, musical instruments, and a kitchen that looked genuinely used. Without the photographs that constantly reminded of Thomas's tragic past. "He usually comes here to escape the pressures," Martha explained, showing them the rooms. "It's the only place where he truly relaxes." Julia placed Luke in the already prepared crib and returned to the living room, where Martha waited with a cup of tea. "Why are you doing all this for us?" she finally asked. Martha smiled softly. "I've worked with Thomas for 15 years. I saw the vibrant man he was transform into a shadow after the tragedy. And then, in recent months, I saw that shadow begin to regain color again because of you. I didn't do anything special." "Yes, you did," Martha gently interrupted. "You reminded him that there is life beyond pain, that it's possible to start over." That night, as Luke slept soundly, Julia walked along the private beach. The waves gently broke on the sand, and the starry sky seemed infinite. How had her life changed so drastically in such a short time? From a car in a car park to a beachfront mansion. From invisible to the center of a media hurricane. The sound of an engine cut through her thoughts. Lights approached from the sea, a small boat heading for the beach. Julia tensed, fearing that journalists had found her refuge. When the boat anchored and a solitary figure jumped into the shallow water, her heart recognized him before her mind. It was Thomas, barefoot with his trousers rolled up to his knees, walking through the water towards her. "How did you know I would be here?" she asked as he approached. "I didn't," Thomas replied simply. "I hoped. I prayed." The silence that followed was not awkward, but full of unspoken things. The sound of the waves cradled that moment, suspended in time. "I saw your interview," Julia finally said. "And? Why expose your life like that? Your pain, your story?" "Because I was tired of living in the shadows," he replied. "Of letting others define my narrative. Our narrative." "There is no our narrative, Thomas," Julia sighed. "You are a billionaire businessman. I am a single mother from the coast. We live in different worlds, do we?" Thomas moved closer, his eyes fixed on hers. "We both know loss, loneliness, the struggle to find meaning when everything falls apart. It seems to me we have more in common than appearances suggest." A gentle breeze rustled Julia's hair, and Thomas resisted the urge to straighten it. There was a line they hadn't crossed yet, unexplored territory between them. "Luke missed you," she said, surprising both of them with the admission. "He looks at the door sometimes as if expecting someone to come in." "And you?" The question escaped before he could contain it. Julia looked away towards the sea. "Me too." They returned to the house together, walking side by side without touching, but somehow closer than ever. In the bedroom, Luke slept serenely. Thomas stopped at the door, watching the baby with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Harry's grown so much," he commented, his voice low not to wake him. "Children do that," Julia smiled, repeating the words she had said in London. The following days established a surprisingly natural routine. Thomas worked remotely in the morning, while Julia took care of Luke. In the afternoon they shared the responsibility of the baby, playing with him on the beach, showing him shells and crabs, teaching him not to fear the small waves that lapped at his tiny feet. On one of those afternoons, sitting on the sand while Luke tried his first firm steps, Thomas shared an idea he had been cultivating. "I'm thinking of creating a foundation," he explained, "to support vulnerable single mothers, not with charity but with real empowerment, temporary housing, childcare, professional training." Julia's eyes sparkled. "That would change many lives." "I wanted you to lead the project," Thomas continued. "No one understands these needs better than you." "Me?" Julia seemed surprised. "I don't have the training, administrative experience." "But you have life experience, intelligence, and empathy," he gently interrupted. "The rest can be learned." That night, after putting Luke to sleep, a task they now naturally shared, they sat on the veranda overlooking the sea. The moonlight created a silver path on the water, and the sound of the waves cradled their conversation. "I received another call from my mother today," Julia commented as they savored a mild wine. "She's truly sorry. She wants a chance to meet Luke, to be part of our lives. And do you want that?" Julia sighed. "Part of me is still hurt. But another part—" She hesitated. "Another part thinks everyone deserves a second chance, that holding a grudge only poisons the soul." Thomas smiled softly. Wise words for someone so young. "It's not wisdom, it's survival," she replied. "I learned that either you forgive and move on, or you remain trapped in the past forever." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning. Thomas knew she wasn't just talking about her mother. "Sometimes I wonder," he began hesitantly, "if I'm ready to move on, if I'm not betraying their memory by wanting to live again," Julia completed, her eyes meeting his in the dim light. "I think the greatest betrayal would be to waste the life you still have because of those who are gone." A comfortable silence settled between them. There was no need to define what was being born there, a connection that transcended the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. The next day, while playing with Luke in the living room, Thomas received a call from Edward. To his surprise, his brother-in-law wasn't calling to argue or question, but to apologize. "I saw your interview," Edward explained, his voice softer than Thomas remembered, "and I realized I was wrong. Amanda wouldn't have wanted you to live like a ghost all these years. She always said your greatest quality was your ability to genuinely care for people." The reconciliation with Edward was like removing the last barrier. That afternoon, Thomas invited Julia for a boat ride, just the two of them. Luke stayed in the care of the housekeeper, a local woman who adored him. In the small boat that glided smoothly through the crystal-clear waters, Thomas finally spoke about Amanda and Philip, not with the lacerating pain of before, but with the affectionate longing of someone beginning to make peace with the past. He told how he met Amanda at university, how Philip was born prematurely and bravely fought to survive, what family Christmases were like, the small traditions they had built. Julia listened with attention and respect, realizing that this sharing was not just a story, it was a gift of trust, the opening of a space that had been sealed for 10 long years. When they returned to the beach, the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. On the sand, the housekeeper played with Luke, who giggled with every wave that reached his little feet. "This is where I used to come when I argued with my mother as a teenager," Julia recounted, her bare feet sinking into the wet sand. "I'd sit on those rocks and imagine what my life would be like when I left Brighton." "And how did you imagine it?" "Funny. I never thought of wealth or fame. I just wanted freedom to see new places, maybe go to university." She smiled melancholically. "Life had other plans. You can still do all that," Thomas said, holding her hand. "The story isn't over." That week on the Isle of Wight was like a healing retreat for everyone. Julia reconnected with her roots, showing Thomas the places that had shaped her childhood, the school she attended, the ice cream parlor where she had her first kiss, the square where she sold crafts to tourists. For Thomas, getting to know that universe so distant from his own was a revelation. The simplicity of life in the small coastal town, the community relationships where everyone knew each other by name, the authenticity of the interactions, everything contrasted deeply with the cold corporate world of London. Luke, in turn, blossomed under the love of his newly discovered grandmother. Mrs. Teresa proved to be a natural storyteller, enchanting her grandson with local coastal legends and songs from her own childhood. At night, when the boy finally fell asleep, exhausted from so many discoveries, the three adults talked on the veranda, rebuilding bridges that seemed irremediably broken. On the eve of their return to London, Mrs. Teresa surprised Julia with a dusty box. "I kept everything," she explained, opening the container that held Julia's childhood drawings, her first school essays, photographs of past birthdays. "Even in moments of greatest anger, I could never bring myself to get rid of these memories." Among the memories there was a yellowed envelope with Julia's teenage handwriting. "Open when I'm 30. Inside, a letter she had written to herself at 15, listing dreams and goals for the future. "I want to study social work and help families in difficulty," Julia read aloud, surprised by her own forgotten words. "I want to create an NGO to support women who, like my mother, need to raise children alone. It seems you always knew your path, Thomas commented, watching the scene with tenderness. You just needed to be reminded. Back in London, life gradually found a new rhythm. The New Beginnings Foundation was officially registered, with Julia as executive director and Thomas as chairman of the board. The first pilot project would be in Brixton, London's largest community, offering integrated support for 50 vulnerable mothers. In parallel, Julia began a distance learning social work course, fulfilling a dormant dream. Evenings were dedicated to studies, while Thomas often fell asleep with Luke in his arms, children's books scattered across the penthouse sofa that now finally felt like a home. The press, which had once been cruel, now respectfully documented the story of redemption and purpose unfolding. Thomas and Julia became symbols of how seemingly incompatible lives could perfectly complement each other when united by genuine values. 6 months after the reconciliation in Brighton, during the inauguration of the Foundation's first centre, Mrs. Teresa travelled to London to honour her daughter. Wearing a new dress specially sewn for the occasion, she watched with pride as Julia addressed authorities and the press. We believe that every mother deserves dignity, every child deserves security, and every family deserves a chance to prosper, Julia declared, her firm voice reverberating through the hall. Our mission is not to offer charity, but tools for these women to rewrite their own stories. Backstage, Thomas held Luke in his arms, the boy now speaking in complete sentences and displaying the same determination in his gaze that characterized his mother. When Julia finished her speech, Luke ran towards her, receiving a tight hug. Mummy spoke nicely, the boy declared, with comical seriousness. Your mother is an incredible woman, Thomas agreed, approaching, and I have something important to ask her. To Julia's surprise, Thomas knelt in the middle of the crowded hall. The murmur of conversations gradually ceased as everyone realized what was about to happen. Julia Evans, he began, his voice slightly trembling. You taught me that life can restart even after the greatest pain, that dignity is priceless, that family is who makes us feel at home. He opened a small velvet box, revealing a delicate ring with a single sapphire. Would you do me the honor of officially building a family with me? The silence in the hall was absolute. Julia looked at Thomas, then at Luke, who watched the scene with curious eyes, and finally at Mrs. Teresa, who smiled through tears. Yes, she simply replied, extending her hand to receive the ring. As the audience applauded, Luke positioned himself between them, raising his little arms for both of them to pick him up. In the joint embrace that followed, the boy surprised everyone by clearly stating, "My daddy and my mummy." Thomas froze, his eyes welling up. It was the first time Luke had called him that. Are you sure? He whispered to Julia. Can he really understand what that means? Children have a wisdom that we adults often lose, she replied, smiling. They recognize true love when they see it. The wedding took place 3 months later, in a beachfront ceremony on the Isle of Wight. There were no extravagances or ostentation, just the simplicity of a love patiently built, brick by brick, on the foundations of mutual respect and genuine admiration. Luke, dressed in a miniature suit, carried the rings with the comical seriousness only a child can have. Mrs. Teresa walked her daughter down the improvised aisle on the sand, while Edward, now reconciled with his brother-in-law, was Thomas's best man. In their vows, Thomas spoke of new beginnings, of how emptiness can be filled when least expected. Julia spoke of dignity, of how mutual respect is the most solid foundation for any kind of love. The party that followed mixed seemingly incompatible worlds, Miller Tech executives dancing folk dance with fishermen from Brighton, renowned chefs serving dishes alongside local cooks, French champagne sharing space with artisanal cocktails. On the Foundation's first anniversary, over 200 families had already been assisted. Julia, now in her 3rd semester of social work, had become a respected voice in public policies for vulnerable women. Thomas, in turn, had found a balance between company and family life that he never believed would be possible again. One ordinary afternoon, while helping Luke with his drawings, the boy, now 3 years old and with an impressive vocabulary, asked an unexpected question. Daddy, how did you meet Mummy? Thomas exchanged a knowing glance with Julia, who entered the room with a tray of juices. How to explain to a child the extraordinary encounter that had changed their lives? Your mother taught me to share, he finally replied, with simplicity. Share what? Luke insisted, curious. Food for starters, Thomas smiled. Then joys and sorrows, and then a whole life. Luke seemed to ponder deeply, as only children can do, before shrugging and returning to his drawings, satisfied with the explanation. For him, family was simply where he found love and security, a much simpler and truer concept than any conventional definition. That night, lying in bed after an ordinary day, Thomas held Julia's hand, observing the ring that shone softly in the dim light. "Sometimes I think about how unpredictable life is," he commented. "If you hadn't walked into that restaurant exactly that night, if you hadn't pushed your plate towards me," she completed, "if I hadn't followed you, if I hadn't accepted the help." The what-ifs were lost in the infinite possibilities. But what mattered was the present, built not from grand dramatic gestures, but from the everyday courage of two people who learned, each in their own way, that starting over is possible, and that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with a simple shared plate of food. The life they built together was not perfect. There were challenges, adaptations, moments of doubt. Julia sometimes still struggled with insecurities about belonging to Thomas's world. He occasionally felt guilty for finding happiness after the tragedy. But day after day, they chose to face these issues together with honesty and respect. And at the center of it all was Luke, flourishing under the love of a family that was not born of planning or conventions, but of the purest human need for connection and mutual care. "I guess that's just how life is," Julia reflected, snuggling into Thomas's arms. "No matter how much we plan, it's the unexpected encounters that truly shape our destiny." "And us?" Thomas asked, kissing her forehead. "Were we destiny or chance?" Julia smiled, remembering that night at the Savoy Grill, when she mustered the courage to ask a stranger for food leftovers. "I think we were a choice," she replied. "The choice to see beyond appearances, to take a risk, to believe that we deserved more than just to survive." Outside, the moon illuminated the sea of the Isle of Wight, creating a silver path on the water. On the beach, the marks of small feet in the sand told the story of a day of play. And in the modernist house perfectly integrated into nature, three people whom improbable destiny had united discovered, day after day, that the strongest families are not necessarily those born of blood or conventions, but those forged in adversity and founded on the constant choice to love and respect. Because sometimes the greatest stories don't begin with once upon a time, but with a simple gesture of sharing, be it a plate of food, shelter in a storm, or the courage to open one's heart to new possibilities when all seems lost. Dear listeners, we hope the journey of Thomas, Julia, and little Luke has touched your hearts. To continue this emotional experience, we have prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories about new beginnings and second chances. You can find it by clicking the link on the left. If this narrative awakened something in you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Daily, we bring new stories that explore the complexities of life and the possibilities of transformation. Share your own experiences of new beginnings in the comments. We'd love to hear your stories too.